When my daughter whispered, "Mom, my mother-in-law said you deserved this," something inside me snapped, and I finally stopped staying silent. Those words didn't come with a warning. They landed in my kitchen one ordinary Thursday morning, the scent of burnt toast still lingering from my clumsy attempt at breakfast. I had been trying to pour her some coffee when she said it, her voice barely above a whisper, her hands clutching the edge of the counter as though the weight of the words might physically pull her down. I remember the precise way she looked at me, eyes wide, almost pleading, as if seeking permission to speak what she had just heard. And for a moment I froze. Coffee halfway to the mug, the soft hum of the refrigerator in the background, and all I could think was, what did she mean? Her name is Emma. She's 26, the kind of daughter who once had endless energy, whose laughter used to fill every corner of our small home, and who now seemed fragile, worn down by something I could almost, but not entirely see. The thought that someone, especially her mother-in-law, could justify behavior like this to her made my chest tighten. I wanted to comfort her, to reassure her that everything would be okay, but I didn't yet understand the depth of what had been done. It started subtly, as these things often do. Emma and her husband Mark had been married just over 3 years. I'd always liked Mark. He was polite, a little shy, with that quiet charm that drew people in. But his mother, Linda was different. There was something about her, an aura that could make even the warmest room feel colder. She smiled easily, yes, but it never quite reached her eyes. And beneath that smile, there was a calculating sharpness I didn't want to acknowledge, until now. Before the whisper that broke me, life had been ordinary, even comforting. I was a school librarian, with long days of organizing books and helping children find worlds they hadn't yet discovered. My husband, David, had passed away 5 years ago, leaving a quiet emptiness that our home was filled with routines, memories, and occasional visits from Emma and Mark. Our house smelled faintly of old wood and vanilla from the candles I always kept on the mantel. I liked it that way, steady, predictable, safe. Emma had always been my confidant, even as a teenager, always quick to share her heart. But lately I noticed subtle shifts. Phone calls that ended abruptly, hushed tones when she thought I wasn't listening, tiny pauses that lingered longer than they should. At first I brushed it off, thinking she was adjusting to married life, maybe struggling with the natural friction of living closely with someone else's family. But that morning, with the soft clink of the coffee mug and her trembling whisper, I realized there had been a current of tension beneath the surface that I had failed to see. It wasn't just what Linda said, it was how Emma's shoulders sagged when she said it. It wasn't just words, it was the invisible bruising of the soul, something only a mother could recognize in her child. We sat down at the small round table in the corner of the kitchen. I poured her coffee, the rich aroma filling the room, trying to create some ordinary anchor against the chaos that was about to unfold. "Emma," I said gently, "what did she mean?" She hesitated, stirring her cup with a shaking hand. "Mom, it's hard to explain. She said you deserve to be treated the way she treats me." I felt a cold shock ripple through me, a mixture of disbelief and protective rage. "Treated how?" I asked, though I already feared the answer. She looked down, her hair falling forward in a curtain that partially hid her face. She makes me feel small, like I'm never enough. She said you deserve to feel the same way, to understand what it's like." I wanted to speak, to reassure her that this wasn't right, but my mind was already racing. For years I had tolerated little slights, polite dismissals, the way Linda's eyes would linger on me with thinly veiled judgment during family dinners. I had smiled, nodded, stayed silent because I didn't want conflict. I had thought perhaps it was easier to keep the peace, to not rock the boat. But hearing my daughter describe the same poison directed at her, it was unbearable. I can still hear the ticking of the clock above the stove as we sat there, neither of us moving for a moment. The sound seemed amplified, counting the beats of time we had wasted pretending everything was fine. That day I began to pay closer attention to every interaction, every subtle glance, every offhand comment from Linda. It started with Emma recounting small things, how Linda criticized her cooking, how she subtly undermined decisions about her own home, how she would speak in that condescending tone, smiling as if sharing wisdom but really delivering a blow. One example haunts me still. It was Emma's birthday and she had baked a chocolate cake, her first attempt in years. She had spent the morning humming softly, flour dusting her arms while I helped her frost it. Later we brought it over to Linda's house, expecting some warmth, maybe a congratulatory word. Instead, Linda cut a slice, tasted it and said, "It's edible, I suppose, but you know your mother's cakes were always better." I could feel my own face burning as Emma's shoulders hunched, her eyes darting toward me for support. I wanted to argue to defend my baking skills, but the truth is, I hadn't said anything. I had smiled politely and nodded, swallowing the rising anger because once again, peace felt easier than confrontation. Over the next few weeks, Emma's subtle revelations piled up like small stones, each one chipping away at the dam I had built to protect myself from Linda's manipulations. I began to see patterns that were impossible to ignore. Invitations to family gatherings were often designed to isolate Emma or make her feel inadequate. Compliments were laced with sarcasm, advice with judgment. And the worst part, Mark often seemed blind to it, laughing it off, trying to smooth over tension without seeing the emotional scars being left behind. I watched Emma shrink in front of me, her vibrant energy dimming, her confidence eroding. The mother-in-law who smiled and baked cookies, the woman who appeared polite and gracious to the outside world, was capable of a quiet cruelty that left lasting marks. And now I knew why she had whispered those words. To plant a seed of doubt, to make my daughter question her worth, to subtly suggest that the mistreatment she received was deserved. I spent nights awake, thinking of ways to shield Emma, to prepare her, to give her the strength I had never fully allowed myself to claim. It wasn't just about standing up for her, it was about reclaiming a voice I had lost somewhere along the line. I had spent years staying silent in the face of Linda's small but cutting remarks. The pointed judgments at family dinners, the thinly veiled criticisms of my choices, my home, my life, but now silence felt like complicity. The first clue that this would escalate beyond whispers came during a Sunday brunch. Emma and Mark had invited me over under the guise of a casual family meal. Linda was there, as expected, moving about the kitchen with that unnerving grace. I had tried to focus on conversation, to keep things light. But then, the subtle barbs began, comments about how I probably shouldn't have let Emma move out so soon, observations on my old-fashioned furniture, jokes about my cooking. Each word was carefully measured to wound without appearing cruel. Emma flinched at everyone, and I noticed for the first time the way she had begun to mirror my own old habits, smiling politely, nodding, swallowing her hurt. I couldn't bear it. Something inside me clicked. I realized that my silence had allowed this behavior to continue unchecked, not just toward me but toward my daughter, and it had to stop. That night I lay awake in my bedroom, the faint smell of lavender from my diffuser filling the room. I could hear the soft ticking of the bedside clock. Every memory of past humiliations and injustices played in my mind like a silent film. And I made a decision. No longer would I tolerate being made to feel small. No longer would I watch my daughter be subjected to manipulation under the guise of family loyalty. It wasn't a dramatic, heroic decision. It was quiet, almost internal, but it was resolute. I started noticing the patterns more clearly, keeping small notes in my mind, observations I could gather. I began to prepare not for a confrontation born of anger, but for one built on clarity, truth, and protection. I had learned that the most powerful voice is not always the loudest, it is the one that refuses to be ignored. In the following days, I began engaging with Emma differently. I asked her about her feelings after visits with Linda, letting her speak freely, validating every hurt she described. We strategized small steps together, ways to maintain boundaries, ways to respond without escalating, ways to protect her own peace. And as we did, I could feel a quiet courage rising in both of us, a sense that we were no longer alone against the subtle tyranny we had endured. The moment of true revelation, the point where the facade would fully crumble, was coming. I could sense it in the way Linda's interactions had grown bolder, the way Emma's frustration and sadness were turning into a quiet urgency. It would not be a single dramatic event, but a series of moments that would eventually make the truth undeniable, leaving no room for denial or excuse. I didn't yet know exactly how it would unfold, but I knew that the whisper that had broken me that morning, the one that lit the fire, was only the beginning. From that moment on, I was no longer just a silent observer. I was ready to step into the role I had avoided for too long, protector, voice, and, if necessary, challenger of the injustice that had quietly haunted our lives for years. I could still see Emma's face that morning, the soft tremor in her lips as she clutched her coffee cup. I could still hear her whispered words, those 4 simple but shattering words. "Mom, my mother-in-law said you deserved this." They were a call to action, a moral spark that lit a fire I could no longer ignore. And in that fire I found a clarity I had never known, a clarity that would guide every step I took in the days to come. The first clue that Linda's manipulations were more than subtle barbs came one Friday evening. during what was supposed to be a simple dinner at Emma and Mark's apartment. I had arrived early, carrying a homemade apple pie, Emma's favourite, since she'd been feeling low all week, and the smell of cinnamon filled the air as I set it on the counter. The apartment was cosy, filled with the soft hum of the refrigerator and the faint scent of vanilla from a candle Mark always liked to burn. Emma seemed tense, moving around the kitchen as if each step might trigger some unspoken disaster. "Mom," she said softly, glancing over her shoulder, "I think she's going to push again tonight." I paused, turning to her. "Push, how?" She hesitated, biting her lip. "She always finds a way to undermine me. Small things, it's like she wants me to feel incompetent. And she said something again about you this morning." My stomach twisted, a tight knot of protective rage and frustration. I had seen this before, Linda's subtle, precise way of making Emma doubt herself, and now, terrifyingly, bringing me into it. I realized I could no longer just watch. The time to act was approaching. The door opened and Linda swept in, her smile wide, bright, perfectly polite. But I had learned to read between the lines. Her eyes were sharp, calculating, glinting ever so slightly in a way that always made my skin crawl. She greeted Mark warmly, then looked at Emma and me, her smile never faltering. "I brought a little something for dinner," she said, her tone smooth, almost buttery, like syrup that masked a bitter truth beneath. I smiled politely, trying not to let my unease show. Linda's visits were always carefully choreographed. She knew exactly how to make someone feel small while maintaining a facade of charm. Emma, however, tensed as I had seen her do countless times before, her hands clutching the edge of the counter. I reached over and touched her shoulder lightly, a silent reassurance. Dinner began normally. Mark served the salad he had prepared, and we chatted about inconsequential things: the weather, a new series Emma was watching, a minor mishap at his office. But Linda's comments, as always, found their way into the conversation like a slow poison. "Emma, are you sure that recipe is right? You know, I used to make it slightly differently. It always turned out better when I did it my way," she said, her eyes glancing at me as if to imply, "See, even your mother's influence isn't enough." Emma froze for a moment, glancing toward me, and I could see the internal battle raging in her expression. Should I defend myself? Should I stay silent? I had felt that battle my entire adult life in Linda's presence, and it was excruciating to watch my daughter experience it. I cleared my throat gently. "I'm sure it's perfect, Emma. I love trying new things with you." My words were soft but deliberate. I wanted to give her a safe space, a shield against the subtle assaults. Linda's smile didn't waver, but her eyes narrowed just slightly. I saw it, and for the first time I felt a surge of clarity. I could no longer be passive. Her behavior wasn't just rude, it was deliberate, calculated, and toxic. And she wasn't just affecting me anymore. She was affecting my daughter, the child I had worked so hard to protect. After dinner, as we cleared the table, Linda made a casual remark that froze me in place. "You know, Emma, I always thought your mother could be a little overprotective, but I guess you're learning eventually that not everyone is as kind as you." Emma's hands trembled as she set down a plate. I caught her eye and saw tears threatening to spill. That was the breaking point for me. I had spent years tolerating Linda's subtle digs, and now I was seeing the effect of that behavior ripple into my daughter's life. When Linda finally left that night, I sat with Emma at the kitchen table, the faint smell of cinnamon from the pie mingling with the subtle tension in the air. I didn't speak immediately. I let her collect herself. Eventually she whispered, "Mom, I can't keep pretending it's okay." I nodded, understanding. "You don't have to," I said softly. "We don't have to pretend anymore, not now, not ever." The next week I started keeping track of Linda's behavior more deliberately. I noted the times she would subtly criticize Emma, the little phrases that implied inadequacy or failure, the sly compliments that were really veiled judgments. I also noticed the patterns in Mark's responses, how he would laugh off her remarks, apologize for his mother, or attempt to smooth over tension without ever recognizing the underlying problem. The discovery that finally crystallized everything happened one Tuesday morning, when Emma confided in me after a particularly difficult encounter. She had gone shopping with Linda, and what started as a casual outing quickly turned into a subtle but relentless judgment session. "You should really consider how you dress," Linda had said, touching Emma's jacket in a way that was both invasive and patronizing. "It's not quite appropriate for someone your age. I always dressed you better than this when you were younger." Emma had frozen, a mixture of embarrassment and frustration coursing through her. "Mom said I could choose for myself. she had murmured, her voice barely audible. Linda's smile was thin, almost imperceptible. "Of course, dear, but sometimes people need guidance, like your mother. She was always so particular." Emma told me the moment she heard Linda whisper about me in front of her, though intended only for her ears. "Mom," she said, "you deserved this, that it was just teaching you a lesson about life." I remember the exact moment she told me. She was sitting on my sofa, clutching a throw pillow to her chest, tears in her eyes but her voice steady, and I felt a mix of fury, heartbreak, and determination unlike anything I had ever felt before. It was clear now, Linda's actions were not occasional missteps. They were deliberate, calculated, and targeted. She had been attempting to manipulate both Emma and me for years, and her attempts had escalated, using our relationship as a tool for control and influence. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I began to plan carefully, not revenge but action. I needed to protect Emma and reclaim our dignity without resorting to cruelty. This required strategy, patience, and evidence. I started recording specific incidents in my journal, dates, times, conversations, and Emma's reactions. I also encouraged Emma to speak openly about her experiences, creating a safe space for her to process and articulate what she had endured. The first step was subtle, setting boundaries during visits. I learned to recognize when Linda was attempting to undermine or manipulate, and I would respond with calm, measured statements that acknowledged her perspective without giving power to her judgments. For instance, when Linda began critiquing Emma's choices, I would say gently, "Emma has made her own decision and I support her. I hope you can too." It was not dramatic or confrontational, but it disrupted the usual pattern. Linda's carefully constructed superiority began to falter when she realized she could no longer manipulate us silently. The tension in her posture, the slight narrowing of her eyes, the forced politeness in her tone, these were all small victories, subtle but meaningful. Then came the moment that made everything undeniable. Emma had confided in me that Linda had attempted to manipulate Mark as well, twisting events to make him doubt Emma's capabilities, creating tension in their marriage. When I confronted Emma about it gently, she admitted, "Mom, she's been doing this for months. And it's not just me, she's trying to control Mark too, using us against each other." It was a turning point. I realized that the problem was no longer a private family issue, it was a pattern of behavior that demanded attention. I couldn't shield Emma by myself anymore. I needed to bring clarity to the entire situation. The discovery led us to a delicate but firm confrontation. I encouraged Emma to speak her truth directly to her mother-in-law, with me present as support. The first meeting was tense, layered with unspoken accusations and fragile politeness. Linda smiled, nodded, and listened, but I could see the calculation in her eyes. She believed she could manipulate the narrative, just as she had always done. But this time we were prepared. Emma spoke calmly, detailing specific incidents, expressing her feelings without exaggeration or anger. I added observations from my own experiences, calmly pointing out patterns of behavior and the impact they had on both Emma and myself. Each word was deliberate, precise, and truthful. Linda's composure faltered slightly. The smile remained, but the eyes betrayed her, shifting, calculating, searching for a way to regain control. For the first time, her usual tactics were ineffective. She could not deny the accumulation of evidence, the consistent accounts, or the emotional clarity with which we spoke. By the end of the conversation, the tension in the room was palpable, but a subtle shift had occurred. We had reclaimed our voice. We had demonstrated that silence would no longer be our default. And although Linda remained outwardly composed, the power dynamics had changed irreversibly. In the following weeks, the change rippled outward. Emma grew stronger, more confident, asserting her boundaries with both her mother-in-law and Mark when necessary. Mark, finally recognizing the toxicity, became more supportive and attentive. Linda's subtle manipulations lost their potency, and the quiet control she had exerted over our lives began to fade. Through it all, I reflected on the journey that had brought us here. The whisper that had shattered my complacency, the careful observation, the deliberate support for Emma, it had been a slow, deliberate process. It was not dramatic or cinematic in the sense of immediate confrontation, but it was powerful in its effectiveness. We had reclaimed agency over our lives, and in doing so, had restored dignity, trust, and clarity. The confrontation with Linda didn't end neatly in one sitting. She left that day with her usual smile, but there was a subtle tremor in the confidence she carried. Emma and I both felt it, like a faint echo of victory, but we knew this battle wasn't over. The quiet war of influence Linda had waged over our lives for years wasn't something that disappeared after a single conversation. The following week, I noticed changes immediately. Emma began to speak up more, asserting her choices, laughing freely in ways I hadn't heard in months. The light that had dimmed in her eyes began to return, and it was almost painful to witness the transformation. It was so long overdue. Even small things like her correcting Linda politely when she overstepped or refusing to accept backhanded compliments became milestones. Mark, too, began to shift. At first his support felt hesitant, almost apologetic. He would nod when Emma recounted incidents, or he'd gently remind his mother when she slipped into old patterns. But slowly he started to stand firmly, realizing the depth of the manipulation we had endured. One evening I overheard him on the phone with Linda. "Emma is an adult. I will not tolerate you undermining her. We've had this discussion before." His voice was firm, unwavering, and I could feel the relief emanating from Emma from the other room. It wasn't just our private world that changed. The ripple effects extended into the public sphere as well. Linda, accustomed to controlling narratives and influencing perceptions, found herself confronted by others who had witnessed her behavior. Word had quietly spread through family gatherings and mutual acquaintances. People began to notice the subtle cruelty, the passive-aggressive barbs, the way she seemed to relish small humiliations disguised as concern. The first public consequence came at a neighborhood event. Linda had attended, smiling broadly, trying to maintain her facade of charm. But as she approached a group of neighbors, someone casually remarked, "It's so strange seeing someone so polite yet so critical of their own family." The words were simple, innocent even, but they struck a chord. A few other neighbors nodded, sharing subtle acknowledgments of similar experiences with Linda's behavior. She tried to laugh it off, but the eyes around her were no longer receptive to her charm. Emma and I observed quietly from a distance, the subtle satisfaction of truth unfolding without our intervention. There was no gloating, no vindictiveness, just the natural consequence of actions becoming visible in the light of shared observation. At home, we continued the process of healing. Emma started setting clear boundaries, both for her own mental health and as a model for Mark. She learned to respond to criticism without shrinking, to assert her autonomy, and to engage with her mother-in-law on her own terms. Each step was small but significant. Watching her grow more confident, I felt a deep sense of pride and relief. I also reflected on my own journey. For too long, I had allowed fear of conflict and desire for peace to keep me silent, to let Linda's behavior pass unchallenged. But the experience had taught me that silence in the face of repeated harm can be a form of complicity. Speaking up, even when it feels uncomfortable or risky, is necessary for the preservation of dignity and the protection of loved ones. There were difficult conversations along the way, moments when Linda attempted to pull us back into old dynamics, but by then we had developed strategies to maintain our boundaries. Emma would calmly state her perspective, I would provide support, and Mark would enforce limits as needed. The power balance had shifted. In the most meaningful confrontation, months after the initial whisper, Linda attempted to manipulate a family decision regarding a shared property. She assumed she could sway Mark and subtly pressure Emma, but this time we were ready. Emma stated her choice clearly, backed by Mark and myself. Linda's attempts to inject guilt and doubt fell flat, met with calm, unyielding responses. For the first time, she realized her tactics were no longer effective. This period of public consequence extended beyond family. Mutual friends, once subtly influenced by Linda's charm, began noticing patterns and speaking up. Conversations that had once been private whispers about family dynamics now became open discussions, and the narrative surrounding Linda shifted. Her perceived control waned, replaced by acknowledgement of the subtle but real harm she had caused. Through it all, Emma and I focused not on revenge, but on clarity, support, and restoration. We did not humiliate Linda or seek to destroy her reputation. Instead, we allowed truth to naturally surface. In doing so, we reclaimed our dignity and empowered ourselves, showing that justice does not require cruelty. It requires honesty, courage, and consistent boundaries. In parallel, I began rebuilding my own sense of self. I reflected on years of compromise, of silenced emotions, of enduring subtle judgments for the sake of peace. I realized that protecting my daughter had also allowed me to reclaim my voice. I started engaging more openly with friends, setting boundaries with others who had previously overstepped, and reconnecting with passions I had neglected. My own confidence grew alongside Emma's. The healing process was gradual. We celebrated small victories, Emma asserting herself at work, Mark expressing gratitude for the support we provided, neighbors recognizing the shift in family dynamics. Each milestone reinforced the lesson we had learned, that standing firm in truth, even quietly, is transformative. Eventually, even Linda began to adjust, though grudgingly. Confronted with clear, consistent boundaries and public acknowledgement of her behavior, she began to temper her actions. While the change was neither complete nor entirely genuine at first, it was enough to create a safer, more respectful environment for Emma and Mark. The atmosphere of tension and subtle manipulation lifted, replaced by a more balanced, healthier dynamic. Through the process, Emma learned resilience. She began to trust her instincts, to assert her needs without guilt, and to approach interactions with her mother-in-law from a position of clarity rather than fear. Mark, too, strengthened his support and understanding, reinforcing the family unit. I observed all of this with a mixture of relief and quiet pride. The journey had been difficult, filled with small, painful revelations and the emotional labor of confronting long-standing patterns of behavior. Yet, through it all, we maintained dignity, compassion, and a commitment to truth. In the end, the whisper that had ignited the journey, those 4 words from Emma, proved to be the catalyst for profound change. "Mom, my mother-in-law said you deserved this." They had cracked the silence I had held for too long and prompted action that not only protected Emma, but transformed the way we engaged with the world around us. As I reflect, I realize the story is not one of dramatic confrontation or explosive arguments. It is the story of quiet observation, careful planning, and unwavering support. It is the story of recognizing subtle harm, asserting boundaries, and empowering those we love to reclaim their dignity. Our home, once heavy with unspoken tension, now feels lighter. Emma laughs more freely, Mark stands more confidently by her side, and even I feel the liberation of having found my voice. We have not destroyed anyone, but we have held firm in truth, demonstrating that integrity and courage can bring justice without cruelty. I often think back to that morning in the kitchen, the smell of burnt toast still lingering, Emma's whisper cutting through the ordinary hum of life. That moment marked the end of silence and the beginning of transformation, for her, for me, and for the family we were determined to protect. We have learned that subtle cruelty, if left unchecked, can erode confidence and happiness, but with careful attention, open communication and courage, it can be challenged, boundaries can be set and healing can begin. Our journey is a testament to the power of voice, the strength of family, and the quiet, enduring impact of standing up for what is right. The weeks following the confrontation were quiet, but in the best possible way. The tension that had clung to our lives like a thick fog began to lift, replaced by a gentle clarity. Emma's laughter returned to the house, filling corners that had been silent for far too long. Mark became more present, attentive and protective, no longer swayed by his mother's subtle manipulations. And I, for the first time in years, felt fully seen and heard, not as someone who tolerated, but as someone who had spoken, acted, and reclaimed a voice I had almost forgotten I possessed. Our family dynamic shifted gradually. Linda, constrained by boundaries we maintained, no longer wielded her influence as she had before. She smiled, nodded, and attended events, but the edge was gone. We weren't responding with anger, just calm firmness, and that made all the difference. The power she once held to wound us through subtle manipulation had faded. Emma began asserting herself in ways that surprised even me. Simple, everyday actions, a polite refusal to accept criticism, a confident opinion about her career choices, the way she spoke to her husband about boundaries, became declarations of self-worth. I watched her grow in confidence, the way a flower opens after months of shade. It was beautiful and bittersweet, knowing how long she had been held back, yet thrilling to witness her reclaim what had always belonged to her. Mark's transformation was equally important. He had been an observer for too long, often caught between loyalty to his mother and love for his wife. Watching him step fully into support without hesitation or apology restored balance in their marriage. One evening, as Emma and I were tidying the kitchen after dinner, Mark joined us, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I see it now," he said quietly. "I see what she's been doing, and I promise it ends here." It was a simple declaration, but its weight was immense. It meant that the subtle battles, the quiet manipulations, would no longer hold sway. Our family unit had become a shield for Emma, a reminder that support and love can counteract even the most calculated attempts at control. The emotional healing was slow, measured, and deliberate. Emma and I spent evenings talking about the past, acknowledging the hurt we had endured, and learning to let go of the resentment that could have lingered indefinitely. It wasn't about forgiving Linda blindly, it was about reclaiming our emotional space and refusing to let her actions define our peace. I also reflected on my own journey. For years I had silenced myself, prioritizing politeness and peace over truth. I realized now that silence in the face of harm doesn't preserve harmony, it prolongs it. Speaking up even gently is an act of protection and empowerment. The lessons I learned weren't only for Emma, they were for me. I had reclaimed my dignity, my voice, and my right to be respected. One evening we gathered for a quiet family dinner. The table was simple but warm, the aroma of roasted vegetables and fresh bread filling the air. Emma laughed as she recounted a story from work, and Mark joined in with a playful comment. I watched them, feeling a swell of pride and relief. This was ordinary life, but ordinary in a way that felt extraordinary because it had been hard-won. Linda attended as she often did, but her demeanor had changed. She was quieter, her sharpness tempered by the knowledge that her influence had waned. She smiled politely, and there were moments of genuine warmth, but nothing like the previous years of subtle tension. The atmosphere was lighter, freer, and for the first time I felt no underlying fear or apprehension. In private, Emma and I reflected on the journey. "Mom," she said one evening, sipping tea by the window, "I can't thank you enough. I don't think I would have had the courage to stand up without you." I reached over and squeezed her hand. "Emma, you had that courage all along. I just reminded you it was yours to use." It was a quiet, intimate moment, filled with the kind of peace that follows struggle. There were no dramatic apologies, no theatrical reconciliations, just recognition, growth, and the knowledge that we had reclaimed control over our lives. The moral lesson became clear to me. Power doesn't always come from confrontation. Sometimes it comes from steady observation, from deliberate action, from refusing to be complicit in harm. Protecting those we love requires vigilance, clarity, and courage. And healing, both for the person harmed and the one who has stayed silent too long, is possible when boundaries are established and voices are heard. As time went on, the family learned to navigate interactions with Linda with grace and confidence. Emma could attend family gatherings without fear, Mark could engage without tension, and I could participate without feeling the weight of unspoken manipulation. The shift was subtle but profound, a daily reminder that truth, patience, and emotional intelligence can transform even the most challenging dynamics. One particularly quiet afternoon, as the light shifted through the curtains and dust motes danced lazily in the sunbeams, I found myself reflecting on how far we had come. Emma was across the room, reorganizing her books, humming softly to herself. Mark was in the kitchen, washing dishes and humming along, and I sat on the sofa, feeling the weight of years of silence lifting from my shoulders. I realized that the whisper that had ignited this transformation, those 4 words from Emma, had not just revealed Linda's behavior, but had sparked a process of empowerment that extended to all of us. It reminded me that courage often begins quietly, that change often starts with a single voice willing to speak. Our journey wasn't just about addressing the wrongs done by another person. It was about learning to see, to understand, and to act when harm occurs. It was about reclaiming dignity, restoring trust, and nurturing the strength within ourselves and our loved ones. In this new chapter, our lives felt lighter, richer, and more connected. We had reclaimed joy in small ways, the shared laughter over a meal, the comfort of honest conversation, the quiet satisfaction of asserting boundaries without hostility. These ordinary moments, once overshadowed by subtle cruelty, became extraordinary markers of healing and resilience. I often think back to that kitchen, the smell of burnt toast and Emma's whispered words. The memory is no longer painful, it is a reminder of transformation. It marks the moment when silence ended, when courage began, and when our family learned the profound value of truth and protection. I sometimes wonder, as I reflect on all of it, how many people endure subtle cruelty in silence, convinced it is easier to stay quiet than to confront it. I think about the strength it takes to observe, to notice, and to speak. I think about the ripple effects of a single voice refusing to be silenced, and the empowerment it can bring to those we love. In the quiet of my home, as I sip tea and watch Emma and Mark moving about with the ease and comfort of genuine peace, I feel a profound sense of gratitude. Gratitude for clarity, for courage, for the lessons learned. And I hope with all my heart that sharing this story will remind others that it's never too late to reclaim a voice, to set boundaries, and to protect those we love. Would you have had the courage to speak, to act, to protect your family when faced with quiet, persistent cruelty. Sometimes the smallest whisper can change everything. If this story resonated with you, consider sharing your own experiences in the comments or subscribing to continue hearing stories that illuminate the resilience, courage, and love that define family life.